Hey there! It's Scarlett's Rosy Thoughts again. Today we are reading The Amazing Red, White, and Blue Striped Thingy, a story by Sally Rippon. The Amazing Red, White, and Blue Striped Thingy, a story written by Sally Rippon and illustrated by Malcolm Walker. Published by Minimax Books. One lovely warm Sunday morning, Mr. Dimble was walking through the park near his home when he came across something in the grass. It was red, white, and blue striped, and it looked a bit like a sweet. Mr. Dimble looked more closely at it. Then he picked it up. It was not a sweet, he decided, because it wasn't sticky. Mr. Dimble wondered what on earth it could be. What do you think it is? Perhaps, thought Mr. Dimble, it is an egg. He looked around, wondering if it could have fallen out of a nest in a tree, but there were no trees nearby, never mind nests, so it couldn't possibly be an egg. Perhaps it is a stone that someone has taken the time and trouble to paint. It would be upsetting to lose such a stone, thought Mr. Dimble. But it was not a stone either, because it was softer than you would expect a stone to be, and not quite so cold. So, wondering whatever it could be, Mr. Dimble put the red, white, and blue striped thing in his pocket, with the intention of thinking some more about it later on. At home. Mr. Dimble enjoyed his walk in the park, and when he finally returned to his home, he went straight to his bookshelves. He took down all his encyclopedias and dictionaries and looked up red, white, and blue striped to see if he could find out what it was that he had put in his pocket. Have you ever put something in your pocket that you weren't quite sure what it was and wanted to find out what it was later? He looked and looked. In fact, he spent so much time looking that he forgot to have his lunch. And he found red, white, and blue striped zebras, red, white, and blue striped sheep, even red, white, and blue striped hats. But he could not seem to find out what it was that he wanted to know. Then Mr. Dimble remembered his special encyclopedia that he kept in his special cupboard. It was massive and very old and deserved to be especially looked after. It was quite out of date, but perhaps it would be of use this time. Mr. Dimble made himself a cup of tea and settled down to carefully flick through the pages of his old encyclopedia. He was just about to give up hope, but just before he did, he found the very rare blooming Gigantosaurus gink plant. This plant is very rare. It has red, white, and blue striped seeds that are about 3 centimeters long. This plant grows very quickly and has a very beautiful flower. Mr. Dimble shouted, "A seed! So that is what it is! Well, I think I'll go and plant it straight away." So off he went to find a plant pot. If he had not been in such a hurry, Mr. Dimble would have read further down the page, and right at the bottom he would have found the warning that said, "Warning! This plant grows so quickly and grows so large that sometimes it can grow as big as a house in 1 week." What do you think is going to happen to Mr. Dimble's house, huh? So much time had been wasted with the books and the planting of the seed that it was dark by the time Mr. Dimble had his dinner. He was so tired that he went to bed straight afterwards. When he woke up the following morning, he did not remember about the seed straight away and carried on cleaning his teeth, getting dressed, preparing breakfast, and tidying up as usual. When he eventually remembered his seed and went to check up on it, he was amazed to find that it had totally outgrown its plant pot. Oh, that must be the seed there. "Well, I never," said Mr. Dimble to his cat. "I had better put it in a bigger plant pot, hadn't I, Kitty?" After searching around for a while, Mr. Dimple found a much bigger plant pot to use. But when he went back to his plant, he was sure that it had grown even more. Either that or he was going mad. He closed his eyes, counted to 10, then opened them again. The plant was still growing. Oh dear, I can't have this plant in the house anymore. I'll have to put it outside in the garden. He tried and tried with all his might to lift the plant in its pot, but it was far too heavy for him, so he had to leave it in the house. Uh-oh, what do you think's gonna happen? The next day, the plant had grown even bigger, and by the end of the third day, the plant was almost as big as the room, and our Mr. Dimple was worrying more and more. By the fourth day, the plant had crept into the kitchen, the living room, and the dining room, and Mr. Dimple was finding it very difficult to live a normal life. On the fifth day, life in the house was even more difficult, as the plant was filling the bathroom and one of the bedrooms as well. Poor old Mr. Dimple just did not know what to do for the best. His neighbors had all complained in case the plant took over their houses too. On day number 6, Mr. Dimple was having great difficulty moving around his own house. There was not even enough space left for his cat to move freely. Then on the 7th day, when the plant was as big as the house and Mr. Dimple had had to move into his caravan in the back garden, the plant suddenly stopped growing. It was such a relief. Mr. Dimple had just started to wonder how to get his house back when something quite marvelous happened. Up until now, the plant had not had any flowers at all, but Mr. Dimple noticed a tiny little bud. Before his very eyes, this tiny little bud grew and grew until it was a small flower, and carried on growing into a bigger flower, and then a huge flower. It was much bigger than the window that it had poked itself out of. It was the most beautiful flower in the whole world. It had gold around the outside that mingled into orange, that mingled into a deep red in the middle. There was still only the one flower, but that was enough to make people passing by on the street outside stop and gasp and say, "Oh, what a beautiful flower!" Well, everyone got to know about Mr. Dimple's flower, and people came from miles around just to see it. Mr. Dimple decided that if people had to come and stare at his house, then he ought to make some money out of it. So he started to charge people to come and see his plant and its flower. He even started to sell hot dogs and ice cream and tea and coffee and pop. In fact, to start with, he enjoyed all the attention he was getting so much, he decided to give guided tours of the parts of the house that people could squeeze into. Weeks and weeks passed, and Mr. Dimple began to get bored with all the people asking him the same old questions, and he wished that the plant would go away so that he could go back and live in his house again. Winter was on its way, and the nights in his caravan were getting chillier and chillier. Oh, there's Mr. Dimple, totally bored. And he put up a fence so people couldn't see it from the road. One day as he stared at his flower, Mr. Dimple noticed that in its center was a red, white, and blue striped seed, just like the one he found in the park all that time ago. He was looking at the seed and wondering what was going to happen next when he heard a rumble from the flower. The noise grew louder and louder until bang! And the seed went whizzing out of the center of the flower and away into the sky. Mr. Dimple and his cat were very shocked by this and nearly fell over backwards with fright. This happening was amazing enough, but there was more to come. Before Mr. Dimple's very eyes, another strange thing happened. The plant's leaves began to wither, the petals slowly dropped off the flower, and the leaves fell off their stems and onto the ground. It was not all that long before all that was left were dead brown leaves all over the floors in the house and in the garden, and the dead skeleton of the plant still stuck in its pot. Mr. Dimple did not quite know whether to be happy or sad. He was really sad that the flower had died because it was such a beautiful sight, but he was definitely happy that he would soon be able to move back into his house. All he had to do was pull all the plant stalks out through his windows and then sweep up all the leaves. He hoped that the dustbin men would not mind if he asked them to take away all the sacks full of dead leaves. He knew they weren't supposed to take his garden rubbish, but they were often quite helpful. The plant had not really done a lot of damage, and in any case, the little amount of repair work that had to be carried out was easily paid for by the money Mr. Dimble had collected from giving the guided tours of his plant and selling hot dogs and coffee. He even had money left over. When all the work was done and Mr. Dimple was once more able to relax in his own house, he took out his old out-of-date encyclopedia and read everything that it said about the very rare blooming Gigantosaurus gink plant. He wished he had read it all before, because he could have had the plant out in his garden from the very beginning, and he would never have had to move into his caravan. But then he would not have met all those nice people either. He was also amazed to read that the plant only flowered once every 100 years. He realized how lucky he had been to have seen this beautiful and rare plant. Mr. Dimple could not help but wonder, though, what had happened to the seed that popped out of the middle of his flower? Where did it land? Which poor, unsuspecting soul would find it the next time? Or would no one ever find it? Perhaps it would just grow wherever it landed. Wouldn't it be awful if it landed on an airport runway? The end. So this book is about lovely old Mr. Dimple finds a red, white, and blue striped something in the park as he goes for a walk. This something changes his life for a while, but adds a lot of color. Sally Rippon. The author is only 14 years old. Boom. Thank you so much for joining me in reading the amazing Red, White, and Blue Striped Thingy, a story by Sally Rippon. And I hope that you have an amazing, wonderful, safe, and healthy weekend. Okay, thanks. Bye.